Doop de doop doop. Doop de doop doop de doop doop. I wanted to clarify a little bit about Peter Singer and why Harriet McBride Johnson was so opposed to Peter Singer's ideas. I'm going to start with what I think Peter Singer's underlying theory of morality and ethics is. I think he's basically some kind of utilitarian. I'm not an expert on Peter Singer. I don't keep up with what Peter Singer writes. He used to be a academic philosopher. I mean, he still is. I think he still has his position at Princeton University. He writes a column for the New York Times, but for the most part, what Peter Singer seems to be doing lately is writing columns in the New York Times that are just controversial, and it seems like he's writing them in order to be controversial. I don't know. Maybe he's just stirring the pot. Maybe he actually believes the things that he writes, but the way he writes them seems pretty driven by the idea of trying to shake people up. I don't know if that's a helpful thing or not. Anyway, Peter Singer came to prominence with an argument about eating animal flesh, eating meat. He is as far as I know, still vegetarian, or maybe even vegan, probably vegan, and made an argument about why it's not moral to eat animals, which I'll get to in a minute. And it relates to Johnson's dispute with him. So I'm going to start with Peter Singer's utilitarian ideas about the value of life. And that's going to get us into who belongs in the moral community. This idea of a moral community is something that ethics people have been using for a while to describe what kinds of beings we think are important to think about when we think about morality. In other words, who do we have moral concern about? And who do we not have moral concern about? So if you're concerned, if you believe that it's important that we be moral, that we be ethical towards some animals, then those animals are part of the moral community, according to you. My cats, for sure, are animals that I think I owe it to them in some way to be nice to them, to care for them, to be ethical to them. I don't treat them and don't believe I should treat them in an abusive way or things like that. So they're part of the moral community to me. That's the basic idea. Alrighty. One of several things that make Peter Singer's utilitarian view unusual is that he uses it to start talking about rights. And very often, utilitarian philosophers end up not talking about rights. And that's because they follow basically a version of what John Stuart Mill wrote in the book called Utilitarianism. I have a big pet peeve about utilitarian writers because so many of them gloss the term utilitarianism by saying that it means greatest good for the greatest number. But John Stuart Mill said that would create a problem that he called the tyranny of the majority. Greatest good for the greatest number would, according to Mill, would say that it's okay to cause a lot of harm to somebody, even a bunch of somebodies, if the corresponding benefit to the rest of us is really, really great. So, a favorite example of mine, should we beat up all the rich people? Well, there's not a lot of really rich people. You know, the 1% and all that. In fact, it's the 0.1% that really have a lot of wealth. And it might give us a lot of pleasure to eliminate those people if we could somehow then spread that wealth around. It sounds kind of attractive to me sometimes, I have to admit. But Mill said that would tell us to do things that a theory of morality really shouldn't be telling us to do. A theory of morality should really be telling us to do good. And, killing Jeff Bezos in order to gather his wealth and distribute it more evenly across a bunch of people, it may increase the pleasure for the majority, but it's still not something you want your moral theory to tell you is a good idea. So what Mill said was that the utilitarian view of the good is to maximize pleasure and minimize pain for all. So there's some important differences. Maximize pleasure and minimize pain means we should do both at the same time, and we shouldn't increase pleasure by increasing pain. We should increase pleasure without increasing pain. And secondly, we should do that for all. One definition of utilitarianism that I picked up along the way, or I guess maybe I made it up. I don't think I did, but I don't remember who I picked this up from, is that what we should do, what the good action is the action that maximizes aggregate net benefit. And what that means, maximize, I think you understand, get the most you can. Aggregate means totaled up. Net benefit means the amount of good that an action does over and above the burdens that that action creates for us. A simple example, would it be a good idea to increase taxes on people with incomes, let's say, over $60,000 a year in California, increase it about $40 for each person making $60,000 a year or more, $40 from each of those people, and use that to make California State University tuition free. In other words, students would not pay any tuition at all. That's how much it would cost if we taxed people making over 60 grand, $40 a year, and used that money specifically for funding tuition at the CSU. How about that? Well, that seems like a great net aggregate benefit. There's 400-some thousand students in the CSU. That's a lot of people to benefit. And the burdens would be spread out so much. Somebody who's making 60 grand, they're probably not going to miss $40. So that would seem to be a good act from that utilitarian standpoint. We're not here to debate that. It's just an example. You have your own political views. I have mine, whatever. Just an example. But there are certain problems with the utilitarian view generally. One is when you say you're maximizing pleasure and minimizing pain for all, we have to understand what counts as pleasure and pain. And we have to figure out who is included in our for all. I mean, after all, maximizing pleasure and pain for all 8.5 billion human beings on Earth, there's not a lot of times in your life that you can do that with an action of your own. So something like definition and limitations on this view are necessary, and Mill didn't provide very clear ideas about how to do that. What he did say about pleasure and pain is that we could judge what is pleasure and what is pain by the people who are most qualified to make that judgment. And that means those who have had the pleasures in question. So, which is the better pleasure? Having the $40 for those people that are making 60 grand a year, or making the CSU tuition free? What's the higher pleasure? Well, the people that would be qualified to judge that, according to Mill, are those that are affected by it, that have 60 grand, that have the $40, that could pay the $40 in taxes, and that went to the CSU and paid tuition there. And so it's really complicated to figure out. Then there's a whole question about how much pleasure and pain something creates, and it gets really complicated. And there are some crazy, crazy ways that people have tried to lay out what this pleasure-pain business means. In the 70s, 80s, 90s, and early aughts, there was this kind of mania for quantifying all of this, for literally trying to count up the amount of pleasure and pain things, different kinds of actions, different kinds of public policies would create. Something about that just doesn't seem right to me. I guess I agree with the philosophers who make fun of that kind of utilitarian calculating by calling it a calculation. It just seems strange to say that morality is about counting up how much pleasure something will create and how much pain it will help us avoid. Very weird. One thing Peter Singer does is kind of opt out of that problem by referring this pleasure and pain thing to an individual having interests. So having interests means that being, that living being, can be benefited or harmed. And it, on a secondary level to that, it includes the preferences of that individual when those preferences can be determined. So interests has two levels for Singer. The very basic idea of interests means that the creature, the living being, can be benefited or harmed in some ways. You have an interest in breathing air that's not poisoned or polluted. You can be benefited and harmed with regard to how poisoned or polluted your air is. That's what that means. About preferences about your life, your own preference may be that the air that you breathe is sea air, because it has that wonderful freshness quality to it, and the breeze is nice, whatever it is, whatever your own preference is. You have an interest in advancing your own preferences, how you would want to live. That's all that really means. Then Singer uses that idea of interests to come up with a theory of rights. And this is also an unusual thing that he did, and kind of cool. He has to believe, that's what I mean here, he relies on the premise. He has to believe that a being that has an interest has a right to what is in their interest. In other words, you have a right to gaining benefit and avoiding harm, to the extent that fulfilling that right doesn't harm others. So there's a little, if you're familiar with natural rights theory, which I'm not going to go into, if you're familiar with that, there's a little bit of a natural rights flavor to this. So you have the right to what's in your interest, what benefits you and avoids harm to you, but to the point that your fulfillment of that interest doesn't harm somebody else. Do you have a right to clean air to breathe, to fresh air to breathe? Sure, you do. But not if it means that harm comes to others in order to fulfill that right. In the Central Valley, our air is terribly polluted as a result of agri-factory. We live in a factory that is run by agriculture. To have fresh, clean, unpolluted air here would really require stopping all of the economic activity that keeps the Central Valley going. At the very beginning of the pandemic, that happened, and we had really clean air for a while. It was pretty cool. But it was doing economic harm to a lot of people in the Central Valley because it slowed our agriculture production and the use of trucks to drive things around almost to a halt. And that would stop the whole economy of the Central Valley, which would hurt everybody in the Central Valley. So, as much it was in my interest to have clean air to breathe while I was cycling through the Central Valley, I didn't have a right to it to the extent that it would harm other people by making it economically unfeasible for them to live here. So I hope that example makes sense. Further, you have a right to what you prefer as your state of being under two conditions. First, that you can express and pursue that preference. You can formulate a preference, and you yourself can seek to achieve that preferred state of being. And to the extent that it is consistent with fulfilling the preferences of others. In other words, that fulfilling your preferred state of being doesn't mean that other people can't or can't even pursue it. If my preference is for drinking coffee every morning, but my preference for being a coffee drinker comes at the cost that the people who grow coffee and harvest coffee are terribly exploited workers and wouldn't prefer to be terribly exploited workers, then my preference to drink coffee comes at the harm of those people who would prefer not to be exploited workers. And so I ought not to do it. Instead, I only drink fair trade coffee. And so my preference for drinking coffee, I try to make more consistent with fulfilling the preference of other people to not be exploited workers. At least I hope it works that way. So, kind of summing up, the rights that we have, the moral rights, are linked to our interests. So the interest in benefit and avoiding harm is basic to all. You have a right to the basic requirements of your interest in remaining alive. No one has a right to destroy your life because you have a natural interest in staying alive. But the interest in being in a preferred state is kind of at a higher level than that. It sort of comes on top of that. So you have a right to pursue life in your preferred state, but you don't have a right to just have your life be in that preferred state. So you have a right to the basics of remaining alive because you have an interest in remaining alive. Remaining alive as you would prefer to live, you don't really have a right to in the same way. You have a right to pursue it, but no one else owes it to you. This may seem a little like Maslow's hierarchy of needs, and it is kind of, sort of. So what this is saying in a kind of boiled down way is that everyone's right to basic necessities. Everyone has a right to the basic necessities because everybody has a basic interest in survival. The right to have more than the basic necessities is conditional. It depends on what it takes from others for you to try to pursue your preferred state of life. So it can't cost other people so much that they can't pursue their preferred state of life, or that it causes them to lose the basic necessities. So your pursuit of what you prefer in life can't interfere with others' pursuits of what they prefer. And it can't be so burdensome on others that it costs them the basics. So here is some odd things that follow from the way Singer has laid this out. Not many Western philosophical, ethical theories, moral theories, come down in favor of suicide. And it's not because a lot of the Western, i.e. European world, is or has been Christian. And I don't think it comes out of religion. It comes out of just the way those moral theories lay things out. But the way Singer developed his utilitarian position, suicide and assisted suicide seem like they would be just fine. Because if a person's preferred state of being is impossible for them to have because of some other condition, then their right to end their life seems like it would be just fine. This is strange because his concept of rights entails the interest in staying alive. The reason why it would happen that assisted suicide or suicide would be morally okay is if the burden that you experience and the pain and harm that you experience from being alive so overwhelmed any benefit you got from being alive that being dead would be a preferred state. Those are really extreme situations, but they can happen in Singer's view. The second thing that's really curious about it is it's not just human beings that have an interest in staying alive or that have a preferred state of their being. Non-human life has an interest in staying alive. Non-human living things can show that they have an interest in a preferred state of being. In other words, Singer expanded the scope of the moral community in a way that it hasn't been before, at least not on these grounds. So there have been many ways that people have kind of chopped this up and tried to figure out who should be within the moral community, whose rights and interests we should consider when we make decisions based on ethics. Who matters? That's what the moral community idea is. So sometimes people decide that it's only human beings, that morality just doesn't apply to non-humans. We can do to non-human beings whatever we choose to do because it only matters morally what we do to one another. That's one way to answer this question of who belongs in the moral community. Another is that only self-conscious beings, and the rationale for that I understand is why self-conscious beings. And by self-conscious, it means a person who's capable of reflecting and understanding their own life. The reason why is they can understand their own life in moral terms. So the moral community would be extended in that case to every kind of living creature who can understand their own lives in moral terms. I'm not sure who else that adds other than human beings. Maybe it's possible that other kinds of apes understand their life in moral terms. There's actually some studies. I got interested in the brain physiology and evolution of morality recently, and I read a couple of books about this idea, one of which was making the case that morality did evolve, and we can see it, at least certain kinds of moral behavior, we can see it among great apes, gorillas, chimpanzees, bonobos. And the author of this book cited several different animal behavior studies that showed what looks like behavior among great apes that's on the basis of what we call morality. I don't know that orangutans read Kant or John Stuart Mill. Probably most of them don't. But maybe it's possible. Or, dolphins are regarded to be very smart creatures. Maybe dolphins are self-conscious and they think about their own lives with other dolphins in moral terms. We know that they communicate extensively and possibly very complexly. So maybe they are. A third possibility for who belongs in the moral community is cognizant beings. So that would be the beings who can be aware of their state of being, who can tell whether they're doing well or doing poorly. That would significantly expand the moral community, probably, because depending on how we judge this, it seems as though, for instance, my cats are aware of the state of their being. They're aware of whether they're having a good day or a bad day. They're aware of whether or not their preferred food is being provided to them or their preferred lap. My cat Valentine really likes it when we have a fire in the fireplace, for instance. It seems like he's aware of his state of being. So maybe he's part of the moral community. Well, what Singer argued about animal rights and eating meat, when I first read this as an undergraduate, I thought it was really cool. He said it's not when we're talking about who belongs in the moral community, the decision shouldn't be on the basis of species. He just dismissed this. It's just arbitrary. Right? Saying it's only human beings, why? There's no rationale for that. To take a step further in this, it would be begging the question to presume that only human beings think about their lives in moral terms, and therefore only moral terms only apply to human beings. It's arbitrary. There's just no solid, logically rational reason for it. Further, Singer said it can't be self-consciousness because that's probably rigging the decision. We would be the judges of what critters are self-conscious or not. And so that would also be speciesist. It would also be basing our decision on who belongs in the moral community on using ourselves as a model. Not their cognizance, which could again rig the decision, but how can we tell which critters are cognizant and which aren't? I give the example of the cat knowing that there's a fire in the fireplace and liking it, and behaving in such a way that we can infer Valentine likes it when we light fires in the fireplace. But we're the ones inferring it. And that's why it could also rig the decision. Someone else could infer that Valentine isn't really behaving in that kind of intelligent way. They're wrong, but someone could infer that. Well, what Singer decided about animal rights is that, and again, you can see how this is related to utilitarianism, it's mere sentience that really matters. And sentience means the capacity to be and to feel benefited and harmed. Sentience means that you can feel pleasure and pain. So what Singer argued was the only thing that matters morally is pleasure and pain. That's straight out of John Stuart Mill. That is exactly what John Stuart Mill said in the book Utilitarianism. So Singer is doing something very directly drawing from Mill when he says that it's just mere sentience that matters in determining who we should care about morally. Wow, so lots of creatures are part of the moral community. And he argued that all meat eating is immoral because all non-human animals have an interest in staying alive and not being hunted, bred, or farmed for food. Say a deer. Human beings have an interest, at least some human beings have an interest in hunting deer and eating venison. Sure, but why is that superior to the deer's interest in staying alive and having good deer life and making more deer? Secondly, many non-human animals used for food do express their interest in a preferred state of being. Their behavior shows what they prefer. Even like cows, who are usually regarded as very stupid animals, Cows will recognize and take care of their own calves, and do so in a way that, according to some animal behavior specialists, demonstrates that when a calf is removed forcibly from a cow, the cow can and does go through something like mourning. So if that can happen with a cow, geez, they're expressing their interest in a preferred state of being all the time. And finally, this is the clincher, every non-human animal with a nervous system is capable of feeling pleasure and pain and responding to it in some way, even if it's just moving toward or away from that thing. I have not read, so I don't know what Singer has to say, if anything, about more recent studies than the stuff that he wrote about not eating meat, that shows that plants express a preference for how they live by moving toward or away from certain kinds of harm, like pruning, which is a kind of harm, and respond to other plants in ways that might indicate something like trying to help other plants, having empathy for other plants. And then we get into some really fun, weird stuff. But I'm not going to worry about that because that's not what I'm here to talk about. So that's why Singer said eating meat is immoral. Every non-human animal with a nervous system is capable of feeling pleasure and pain. And if pleasure and pain are what count for being part of our moral community, then every non-human animal belongs in our moral community. But then, weirdly, really weirdly, Singer notoriously, and this is what Johnson attacks him for, goes a totally different direction when he talks about neurodivergent and, in other ways, atypical fetuses and children. So, for instance, the general idea is, to the extent that a neurodivergent fetus or child is incapable of forming and expressing a preference for a state of being, they have no interest in the condition of their lives. So, to make this concrete, I use the example of Ashley X, whom you remember was the young girl whose parents decided that they would have certain surgeries performed on her in order to keep her small and so forth. Singer actually wrote a piece in the New York Times about Ashley X and said that she could have no interest in her condition because she couldn't have the cognitive ability to form an interest. She had no way of preferring one state of existence rather than another. So, Singer argued, anything that her parents did to her would be moral. Why? Because Ashley couldn't say or express that she didn't want that done, or that she wanted something else done. Now, here's what's weird about this to me. If every creature that can feel pleasure and pain is part of our moral community, why then do we add to neurodivergent children this additional obligation, this additional burden of proof that they're part of the moral community that we don't do with fish? Do fish articulate, now, better than fish, do shrimp articulate that they prefer certain states of being over others, and therefore we shouldn't eat them? Or does Singer just assume that they have a preferred state of staying alive? How do shrimp express their preferences in life? From our perspective, we can't tell how shrimp express a preference for how they live. So the criterion of being capable of forming and expressing a preference Singer doesn't apply to critters that we might eat, but he does apply it to children like Ashley X. She has no interest in her condition because she's incapable of forming it and expressing it, he says. But then the shrimp is capable? That's very strange. Even stranger. Singer argued about disabled children, and disabled is in scare quotes because he is assuming something about what makes somebody disabled. He is assuming that the medical model of disability is the right way to think about disability. The medical model says that disability is a condition of the body or mind of the individual. But there are other ways of understanding what disability is, or what constitutes disability. The condition of the body and mind of the individual isn't disabling. What's disabling is the built environment not providing ways for that person with that condition to live well. That's the social model of disability, in contrast with Singer's assumed model, the medical model. So already he's just ignoring tons of stuff about disability from critical disability studies and from philosophers and other people who write from a disability standpoint. He's just ignoring all that and going with the medical model. Secondly, he has argued that a severely disabled fetus or child, whatever that means, severely disabled, may have no interest at all in remaining alive. So, similarly to somebody in a persistent vegetative state, a persistent vegetative state means that there is no evidence of any higher brain function, or sometimes any brain function at all, for 48 hours. If for 48 hours there's no, I think it's alpha waves, that show some kind of brain function that is cognitive, if there is no cognitive brain function whatsoever for 48 hours, and I don't mean cognitive in some fancy way, just being able to sense things, then that person's in a persistent vegetative state. Now, that person can't even tell whether they're alive or not. Singer is comparing what he calls severely disabled children or fetuses to people who can't tell whether they're alive or not, who can't sense their aliveness because their brain isn't sensing things. That is very odd and doesn't follow, in my view, does not follow from what he said about not eating animals and what his general utilitarian model is. It's a very odd departure from his philosophy otherwise. It's as though he has made a weird cutaway for disability that the same rules that he applies elsewhere don't apply to the severely disabled just because they're severely disabled. Well, why? So, what it really boils down to is that the benefits and harms ratio of severely disabled is that there couldn't be any benefit to their being alive that outweighed the burdens of their being alive. That's what he argued. Now, for whom is it the case? Remember my discussion of suicide as related to utilitarianism, Singer's utilitarianism. He applies that notion of suicide being morally okay to those who are, quote unquote, severely disabled, whatever the hell that means. So how do we determine what the ratio of benefits and harms is? How does anybody, other than the disabled person, determine the benefits and harms of that person being alive? Who can tell me whether the benefits and harms of my being alive are such that being alive is better than not being alive? Who can judge that other than me? How do we determine that ratio, and who determines that ratio? Who can say whether someone else's life is so burdensome to that person that there is no sufficient benefit to their remaining alive? Singer thinks he can judge it, and did so. This is deeply, deeply weird. If you can't formulate and express an interest, how is it that non-human animals are included? I don't get it. And this is a second question that I would have wanted to ask Peter Singer if I could have. He dismisses as speciesist the idea that only human beings count in the moral community. And one way that that argument is made is what makes human beings special, why only human beings matter, what makes us special, other than if we just assume it. And one of the things that people say in order to try to save the idea that the only creatures that matter morally are human beings is that only human beings can think and use language and that sort of thing. Well, in that case, are neurodivergent people who can't use language not people? And if so, isn't it speciesist of Peter Singer to say that neurodivergent people who can't express their interest are not members of the moral community, that they don't matter, and that aborting those fetuses or committing infanticide of those children is morally a-okay? And that's the conclusion that Peter Singer actually drew, that there are some people whom he has judged based on his conception of their benefits and burdens of remaining alive, that they are having such great burdens from being alive that it's not worth it to them to stay alive. And therefore, it's okay for other people to decide to end their lives. There's a whole lot of leaps and jumps there that he is at pains to explain. How does that come from his initial utilitarian ideas? And I suggest it really is kind of a speciesist claim. He's basing this decision that very neurodivergent fetuses and children aren't really counted in the moral community, and his basis for assuming that has to be their neurodivergence. What else would be the case? Why else would that idea of benefits being outweighed by the burdens even arise for them? So I hope that helps explain sort of what's going on in Singer's position. And this is what Johnson was attacking. Essentially, I think she says that Singer's view about neurodivergent and atypical physical and mental persons could be ethically killed because the burdens of their life will outweigh the benefits of their life, is basically a kind of genocide or a eugenics of all kinds of disability. That it would open the door to all kinds of eugenics. Interesting stuff.